What sounds like fiction, but is actually a real historical event. 4 Auschwitz prisoners stole Nazi uniforms and a car. Only one of them was speaking German, so he was wearing the highest rank uniform. When they left the camp, they've encountered 2 patrols. First patrol, with some high-ranked guy, just hailed to them. Second patrol with 2 low-rank soldiers told them they can't leave because orders etc. Guy speaking German started screaming at them so loud and so realistically they just said, "We are sorry, go ahead." Edit, u/aviation.com found a documentary/movie about this. Vimeo, thanks again buddy. You're an absolute unit. Hope people will stop asking for it in comments. Here's a link to the story, though I've heard it when I visited Auschwitz 2 years ago. When you're there and see that place, you really understand how fucking amazing those guys were independent. During WW1, the German Navy built a ship and painted it to make it look like a British ship called the RMS Carmania in order to infiltrate and destroy British convoys. On the ship's first outing, the first enemy it encountered was the real RMS Carmania, which promptly sunk it. Spider-Man meme. In 2007, a paraglider got trapped in the updraft of 2 joining thunderstorms and was lifted to an altitude of 33,000 feet. She landed over 3 hours later about 60 kilometers north of her starting position, having survived extreme cold, lightning and lack of oxygen. That sounds scary. Imagine spending 3 hours in the sky and not being able to get back down. Jean de Clisson, 1300 to 1359, was married to a French nobleman who was beheaded for treason by the French king. Enraged, she sold their estate and purchased 3 black warships with red sails and became a pirate queen of the English Channel who targeted French ships. She became known as the Lioness of Brittany, and in her 13 years of piracy she would slaughter every member of a ship's crew except for one, so that last survivor could go back and tell the French king what had happened. Why do I feel like the 1300s never get talked about? The Great Mollusc Flood of 1919. A tank filled with 2-meter gallons of mollusc burst and sent a tidal wave of mollusc through the streets of Boston. 21 people were killed. Imagine standing in the streets as a tidal wave of mollusc approaches and just thinking to yourself, well, I guess this is how it ends. Death by mollusc. Timothy Dexter was frequently given terrible business advice that would somehow through a stroke of luck pay off. He sold coal to Newcastle and made a profit. He became insanely wealthy, dressed in a strange manner, and acted weird in the company of the incredibly wealthy elite he had accidentally stumbled into. He spent a lot of time basically gaslighting his own wife for his own amusement. For quite some time he acted as if she had died and was a ghost, even introducing her to other people as his wife's ghost. He at one point even faked his own death so he could see how people would react at his funeral. He also wrote a book that was a long-winded rant about everything that upset him. The book included no punctuation. He made a second edition with several pages of punctuation attached to the end that the reader could distribute as they saw fit. Basically a real-life chiz post that the reader could distribute as they saw fit, or as he actually spelled it, pepper and salt it as they please. The escape from Antarctica by the members of the Antarctic expedition led by Ernest Shackleton. The stuff they went through was unbelievable. Their boat, the Endurance, was crushed by ice floes. They were stranded on the floes for over a year in temperatures well below freezing. They then took to 3 boats around 22 feet in length across the Antarctic Ocean looking for land. There were about 10 men in each boat. They missed reaching land by just a few miles at times. 2/3 of them got stranded on Elephant Island surrounded by ice, while one of the boats went out in search of rescue. That boat made it through the Drake Passage, one of the deadliest places in the ocean. All but 3 of them got stranded with little food and water, while the 3 men who left became the first people to cross South Georgia on foot. They found civilization, rescued the men who came through the Drake Passage, waited months until they could rescue those on Elephant Island. Every single person who came on the initial voyage survived, with the worst lasting consequence being a single foot amputation. I'm shocked that this has not been made into a major movie or mini-series. An English king named Ethelred, later called the Unready, took some troops to defend against a Viking invasion. The weather was bad, so a lot of the Vikings' ships crashed as they were landing. Ethelred thought that it would be dishonorable to attack them as they were stumbling onto shore, so he kept his troops back until the Vikings had a chance to get together and form proper battle lines before he attacked them. The better prepared Vikings then won the fight and slaughtered a bunch of Ethelred's men, and he and the rest were forced to run away while the Vikings went around pillaging. Also, his sobriquet does not mean unready in the modern sense, as in unprepared, but rather ill-advised. Ethelred, the name meaning well advised. A hilarious pun. The battle for Castle Itter near the end of WWII saw US soldiers, French POWs, and the German army fighting on the same side to hold the castle against an SS tank division. To make it even weirder, the French prisoners included several prime ministers and a tennis star, 2 prime ministers, 2 French generals, a former SS officer, and Charles de Gaulle's sister. Someone get Tarantino on the phone. He needs to work on this. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a novel in 1838 in which 4 shipwrecked survivors, at the point of starvation, choose to resort to cannibalism. So they kill the young cabin boy, Richard Parker, and eat him. In 1884, a ship called the Mignonette sank. 4 crew members survived. At the point of starvation, they killed and ate the youngest of them, Richard Parker. The inspiration for the tiger's name in Life of Pi. Jack, a baboon who was employed to change rail signals. After initial skepticism, the railway decided to officially employ Jack once his job competency was verified. The baboon was paid 20 cents a day and a half bottle of beer each week. It is widely reported that in his 9 years of employment with the railroad, Jack never made a mistake. An official investigation was initiated after a concerned member of the public reported that a baboon was observed changing railway signals at Uitenhage near Port Elizabeth. Can you ducking imagine? The Great Stink was an event in central London in 1858. The hot weather exacerbated the smell of untreated human waste and industrial effluent that was present on the banks of the River Thames. Wikipedia. The Great Stink led to London building its sewer system. Mad Jack Churchill, the man with the only confirmed longbow kill in WWII. Guy and his squad did a death march towards the Germans while playing bagpipes, got captured and sent to a concentration camp. He then escaped, got caught again, and then escaped a different concentration camp. Also, he always carried a Scottish longsword with him. There's so much other weird shit he did after the war, and it's amazing to me that has entirely real. If you think Mad Jack Churchill was crazy, go read up on Adrian Carton D. Wyatt. This man bit his own finger off to get back into combat, swam away from a plane crash one-handed, and considered a war in which he was shot in the head and lost a hand and an eye to have been good fun. Wikipedia. Louis XIX was king of France for 20 minutes. The shortest war ever recorded was around 40 minutes long. During the Salem witch trials, dogs were also accused of witchcraft. 2 dogs were executed because of it. Was the 40-minute war between the British and natives of the island of Zanzibar? The CIA was researching psychic abilities for 30 years as a way to spy on the USSR. After 30 years, the program was terminated, and their conclusion was that psychic powers probably don't exist. Edit. The actual conclusion was that the evidence for remote viewing was unfalsifiable and therefore unprovable. Many of the more promising results were believed to be caused by information leakage, meaning that test subjects had prior knowledge about the subject they were asked about. They were unable to verify any of their results because of this, and even if the psychic abilities were real, they were unreliable at best. Edit 2. The codename for the project was Stargate. You can find the documents on the CIA website here. The Men Who Stare at Goats. Terror, probably the only Wikipedia article I've ever read where they just give up on their dry scientific explanations and basically say, look, here's what the historical records say. I just, here, okay, ate live cats, snakes, eels, puppies, and was suspected of eating a toddler roe. Unsinkable Sam. A cat that survived the sinking of 3 different ships during WWII. Wikipedia. That cat 100% sank those ships. The Life of Harriet Tubman. One of the rare examples of someone who is a household name for being a badder who was actually about 10 times more badder than people know about. Things she did other than the Underground Railroad. 1. She financed and recruited for John Brown's Harper's Ferry slave revolt raid, and the only reason she didn't fight in person was she was bedridden with malaria. 2. During the Civil War, she joined the Union Army as a cook/nurse. 3. She somehow class-shifted into a spy/scout and helped Union leaders plan raids into Confederate territory. And she alienated several Confederates. 4. She rose in the ranks until she commanded a small raiding force of 300 Union troops from the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, the second black US Army unit ever. 5. Her command, Company C, 54th, raided southern plantations, slaughtered slave drivers, and freed captive slaves. 6. In the Combahee Ferry raid, where the 54th freed 700 slaves, she was also in command of 3 Union frigates, and when a Confederate division was advancing on them, she fired broadsides from the 3 naval warships directly into the enemy troops. 7. She survived the war and immediately turned around and started fighting for women's suffrage. Why don't they teach this in school? That is insane. Edit. Have learned about the Underground Railroad, was referring to the rest. The Soviet scientists starving to death saving the seed bank of Leningrad during Hitler's invasion in the winter of 1941-42 despite it being full of corn, wheat and potatoes. What happened? The London beer flood of 1814, a 22-foot tall beer vat blew out and at least 100,000 to as much as 323,000 imperial gallons give or take flooded slum dwellings, killing 8 people. 5 of those people killed were at the time at a celebration of life service for someone else. Smithsonian Mag. I don't have the time to look for a link, but I remember a story of a big whiskey spill like this where some of the casualties were from alcohol poisoning, drinking muddy whiskey from puddles in the road. The Dancing Plague of 1518. People left their friends behind. It was terrible. Not exactly historical, but a poodle named Cachi in Caballito, Buenos Aires, fell from 13 floors and fatally hit 75-year-old Marta Respina, killing both instantly. In the course of the events, 46-year-old Edith Sala, who came to see the incident, was fatally hit by a bus. An unidentified man, who witnessed Edith's death, had an heart attack and also died on his way to the hospital. Edith Sala, who came to see the incident, was fatally hit by a bus. Did this woman have fortune-telling powers and just use it to witness hilarious deaths? Wojtek was a bear who fought Nazis in return for cigarettes and beer. He didn't die until 20 years after WW2. My favorite part about that story is that after the war he lived in a zoo. It was common for soldiers from the bear's company to come visit and simply jump into the enclosure to play with him, much to the zookeeper's annoyance. A Russian Tsar had a bomb thrown at him, avoided it, and thought it was a good idea to stay there to look at the damage. Enter second guy with bomb. Orman, you mean Alexander III. Lenin himself watched the execution of his brother in a slightly earlier elimination attempt. Spartan weddings. Basically, young Spartans would train 4 years in camps, surrounded only by men. So, when the time came for marriage, the women would shave their heads and dress in men's clothing, since the idea of having sex with anyone other than a man weirded out the grooms. I don't know, man sounds a little gay to me. Children's crusade in the middle of the 12th-13th century crusades, up to 30,000 children followed a couple teens to convert Muslims to Christianity. It went about as well as you'd expect. Wikipedia. This followed the disastrous Fourth Crusade, which had the Catholic army get excommunicated by the Pope and become a mercenary army. LMAO, just imagine the slave traders' delight when 30k children walked into their shop to be sold. They was like, it's free real estate. Sergeant Stubby. During World War I, a soldier found a stray dog when training on the Yale University campus and took a liking to him. The soldier snuck the dog onto the ship when he had to leave campus, and when the dog was found by the commanding officer, he was allowed to stay because he had learned how to salute. Stubby was injured a few times during the war, but he was useful with alerting his squad of surprise mustard gas attacks and gunshots before the human ear could detect the sound. He also found and comforted wounded soldiers and caught a German soldier by the leg of his pants until American soldiers got to him. Aka, the best test boy to ever live. Reminds me of the Polish bear who fought in WWII and was promoted to corporal. The Biafran genocide, aka the Nigerian Civil War. It happened only about 50 years ago, and over 3 million civilians died. My dad fought in the war as a child soldier on the Biafran side. You've probably never heard of it, despite its scale and recency, because it's been almost entirely swept under the rug. They don't even teach it in history classic. Edit. Thanks for your concern, my father. He lost a substantial number of his childhood friends to the war. He was also air-bombed while in class and was among the few survivors, but he is pretty well adjusted as far as I can tell. He doesn't go into too much detail about it, and he still gets pretty angry on the inside, but he's come to accept it and look towards the future. In school, we don't learn about Africa at all except for ancient Egypt, the slave trade, and some of apartheid. That's it. We learned almost nothing else about that entire continent. Operation Mincemeat. The Allies planted a dead body with fake battle plans to trick the Germans into thinking that the Allies were going to attack Sardinia when they were in fact going to attack Sicily. They built an entire life for this dead, fake, military man, dumped him in the ocean, and successfully distracted the Germans. Wikipedia. I love this story. It's so detailed and crazy and amazing, and it worked. Joshua Norton was just this random crazy guy from San Francisco who hated all this political nonsense that was going on at the time and figured he could do the job better at it himself, and thus the Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico was born. While he held no real power, the people liked him so much that they treated him like royalty anyways. Any currency issued under his name was treated like real money at many establishments. One day, he was arrested by a private security force because of his mental health, which enraged practically all of San Francisco. The police chief let him go because he had committed no crime, and Norton gave an imperial pardon to the guy who arrested him. After this incident, any police officer Norton pard would salute him. Another time, when a riot had formed and was getting pretty violent, Norton simply stood in front of the mob and calmly prayed, which managed to disperse the mob. And that's not even a fraction of the crazy stuff that he did. So, you're telling me the Emperor of San Francisco from Christopher Moore's books is real? Did he have 2 dogs as well? President Andrew Jackson's funeral in 1845. His pet parrot had to be removed because it was swearing loudly, and he also left a giant rotting cheese wheel to his successor Van Buren. He had received 2 as a gift, and he held a giant party in the White House where people could just show up and drink and eat of the first 1,200 pounds cheese wheel gift, but the other remained in the cellar for 2 years till Van Buren took over. 21 Sikh soldiers fought against 10,000 Afghan intruders and won. It is known as the War of Saraighi, and won. Not exactly. They were overrun and completely wiped out. All 21 died, but they held out long enough for other British forces to muster and ultimately defeat the invasion. Here's an extra credits video on it. I don't know if this counts as a historical event because it happened in 2010, but the owner of the Segway company, Jimmy Heselden, died by driving a Segway off a cliff near his estate in Yorkshire. Edit. Thank you all who corrected me on the demonstration part. According to Wiki, it had nothing to do with him demonstrating anything. He was just riding it one morning. From the article, on the morning of the 26th of September 2010, Heselden was killed when he fell from a cliff footpath into the river wharf at the village of Thorpe Arch near Boston Spa. A Segway vehicle was found near him. The West Yorkshire coroner concluded that Heselden had died accidentally and that he had probably got into difficulty when he reversed his vehicle to allow a man walking his dog to par. In 1985, Philadelphia police bombed a residential neighborhood. The resulting explosion destroyed 2 city blocks, killing 5 children and 6 adults. I watched that fire from my house just outside of West Philly. I'm shocked at how many people have no knowledge of the 5th largest city dropping a bomb on itself that resulted in the deaths of 11 citizens and the destruction of 61 houses. The Battle of Samar, October 25, 1944. Taffy III, a group of around a dozen small American escort carriers, destroyers, and escort destroyers, found themselves under attack by the center force. Around 24 of the most powerful warships in the Japanese Navy, including battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Thanks to the incredible bravery and determination of every ship involved, and incompetence on the part of the Japanese forces, they inflicted heavy casualties on the vastly superior force, and got them to retreat. Some highlights include the destroyer Johnston scoring first blood by blowing the bow off the cruiser Kumano with torpedoes, charging the largest battleship ever built, Yamato, and forcing her to retreat with more torpedoes, though this may have actually been the destroyer Holle's doing, shooting up the battleship Iruna and the cruiser Tone, and driving off an entire destroyer squadron by herself. All this time the Johnston was under near constant fire, tanking several battleship-grade shells as repair crews were furiously working to keep the ship operational. In her last moments fighting, she was exchanging fire with up to 4 cruisers and several destroyers. The Johnston fought so valiantly and caused so much damage the Japanese thought she was a cruiser, and when she was finally sunk, the captain of the destroyer Yukikase was seen saluting her as she went under. The destroyer Hirman exchanging broadsides with the battleship Nagato and cruiser Saguro and Tone, and later racing destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts in her pummeling of the cruiser Chikuma. Hirman would be the only destroyer of Taffy III to survive the battle. The destroyer Hull firing lances of torpedoes that temporarily takes battleship Yamato and possibly the cruiser Hiruna out of the fight for some amount of time, and exchanging fire with an unknown Tone-class cruiser. Unfortunately, Hull didn't share the good fortune of the rest of the destroyers, and was sunk early in the battle. The escort destroyer Samuel B. Roberts charging the Japanese force alongside the destroyers of Taffy III, despite being significantly slower and weaker, striking the cruiser Choke with at least 1 torpedo. However, she is most known for firing her entire ammunition supply into the cruiser Chikuma, severely damaging her stern, and mauling the ship's superstructure as well as setting her bridge on fire, actions that would earn her the nickname the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. Chikuma would later be scuttled, partially as a result of the damage Samuel B. Roberts dished out. However, the destroyer escort herself would not survive the battle, the only ship of her class sunk at Sama. The escort carrier White Plains severely damaging the cruiser Choke with her sole 5-inch gun, triggering a massive chain of explosions that would force her to retreat and later be sunk by aircraft. White Plains also took a very close near miss from one of Yamato's shells early in the battle that crippled her superstructure and put her out of action for several minutes, so much so that the Japanese ship assumed she would sink, but good damage control meant she recovered quickly and would survive the battle. All in all, 3 Japanese cruisers were sunk and 3 more were severely damaged, along with 1 damaged destroyer. The US lost 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort, with most other ships taking damage as well. There is absolutely no logical reason the US forces shouldn't have been completely curb-stomped here. Things couldn't have been weighed more heavily in Japan's favor. But somehow, Taffy III pulled off a miracle. That's a pretty basic summary of things. Trichinefil has a great video on the battle, which can be seen here. In the Navy we call this the last stand of the Tin Can Navy. It's considered to be one of our finest hours. The surgery with a 300% mortality rate. It's a pretty great story. Just imagine what it was like to receive medical treatment if you were born just 2 centuries earlier. There are 3 separate defenestrations of Prague. The word defenestration was coined to describe the third one. The defenestrated parties survived in the third one. The Catholics claimed angels helped them down. The Protestants claimed they landed on a dung heap. Historians think they survived because they were only on the 2nd floor. To this day, political protests in Prague often involve defenestrating someone in effigy. Apparently, death from laughter is an incredibly rare, but a completely legit cause of death. In the 3rd century BCE, Chrysippus, a Greek Stoic philosopher, died of laughter after he saw a donkey eating his figs. And Chrysippus is not the only isolated case. Among the few other cases, a 5th century BCE Greek painter, Zeuxis, is said to have died laughing at his painting of the goddess Aphrodite, for which an old woman, who had commissioned the painting, had insisted on modeling. Also, Cleopatra, the ruler of Egypt in the 1st century BCE, claimed that her retainer died laughing at her husband's death. According to the linked Wikipedia article, the most recent case is that of Ole Benson, a Danish audiologist, who saw a funny scene in a comedy film and laughed so hard that his heart rate rose to a point where he had a fatal heart attack in 1989. From what I understood from reading up on this topic, it's not the act of laughing itself, but rather a fatal repercussion from a fit of laughter, such as cardiac arrest, asphyxiation or aneurysm, which causes death. For instance, Ole Benson suffered a heart attack as a consequence of the terrible fit of laughter he had. It's possible that such was the case of Chrysippus and others as well. I always thought of "I'm gonna die laughing" as a hyperbole, and I myself use it quite liberally. But I guess every hyperbole has a grain of truth to it. Close bracket. Is a donkey eating figs really that funny? Salyut 7 Space Station Rescue. Wikipedia on the 11th of February 1985. Contact with Salyut 7 was lost. The station began to drift, and all systems shut down. At this time the station was uninhabited, so Nabokov piloted his ship to intercept the forward port of Salyut 7 and matched the station's rotation. After hard docking to the station and confirming the station's electrical system was dead, Nabokov and Savinik sampled the station atmosphere prior to opening the hatch. Attired in winter fur-lined clothing, they entered the station to conduct repairs. Matched the station's rotation. Matthew McConaughey, is that you? In the Middle Ages, gays and lesbians would become nuns and monks to avoid persecution, and since religion was a heavy influence in those days, it was seen as noble that they were dedicating themselves to God. They would have special friends, and since no one could get pregnant, it wasn't that big of an issue. That's still going on. In 1971, a teenage girl named Julian Cope was on a plane that was struck by lightning and disintegrated in the air. She plummeted 3,000 meters strapped to her seat and landed in the Amazon rainforest. Her mom had been on the flight with her, and Julian searched in vain for her mom, but Julian was the sole survivor of the crash. She survived 11 days alone, treating her maggot-infested wounds with fuel and using tracking techniques her father had taught her before she found a boat that she used to make her way back to civilization. What an absolute legend. Edited for clarity. Close bracket. Plane that was struck by lightning and disintegrated in the air. Lightning can do that? It's not historical, but I doubt you'll believe me without a link. It was like 20 years ago. In my town there was a shooting accident that was pretty crazy. This woman was practicing with her husband's rifle out in the field or something, and she got a shot off which made its way to the highway and struck a motorist in the head, killing them. The driver was the shooter's twin sister, who was separated at birth. She lived like 300 miles away and was literally just parting the town to go someplace else when she was killed by a stray bullet from the sister she never knew she had. That's still like the craziest coincidence I've ever heard of. Edit. I'm going to bed right away so I don't wake up to tons of the same comments. No, I couldn't find the link. I'll say it was in Canada, but I'm more comfortable being called a liar than I'm putting my exact location out there. I don't think you'd find anything if you had that anyways. I did try to Google it some more in depth and couldn't find anything. It's a highly unlikely story with nothing but my word to back it up in the end, so make of it what you will. Good night. Any link then? When you read the real John Brown story, from Kansas to Harper's Ferry, it just doesn't seem real. Fundraising, Canada, clandestine fundraising, religion, asking everyone to join, betrayal by friends, martyrdom, etc. John Wilkes Booth was at his execution, and part of the army forces sent to capture him were Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart. The East German balloon escape. In 1979, two families escaped East Germany to West Germany by a homemade hot air balloon. Edited for redundancy. There's a couple great escapes, like when the border was still new and some geniuses got past by lowering a convertible until it was shorter than the gate's arm and just gunned it through the checkpoint. The death of Ken Rex McElroy. He terrorized Skidmore, Missouri for decades, stalking, assaulting, murdering and raped two 14-year-olds who were his wives. He had an expensive attorney, so he was never charged. The law never helped the poor town. One day, the town gathered for a meeting on how to deal with McElroy. Details get a little vague here, but apparently someone alerted the room that McElroy was in the bar up the street. Quietly and calmly, everyone got up and walked over to the bar. As McElroy got into his truck, someone shot him in the back of the head. The town just went back to their business. When the witnesses, like the entire town, were questioned, everyone claimed they didn't see anything. No one has ever been arrested. There's a miniseries documentary about the incident called No One Saw a Thing. It's pretty interesting. Many of the residents believe the town is cursed because a couple of unrelated, unsolved murders and disappearances happened over the years after McElroy's murder, and they stained the town's reputation. They also interview McElroy's wife and children and you learn how the incident affected them. It's a pretty in-depth exploration of the grey morality of vigilantism and how the consequences of actions can have long-lasting effects. Edit, a word. Start of World War I doomsday culmination gone wrong until the driver takes the wrong turn, allowing it to go right again. Sets of armed conflict between two countries, but those two countries have allies, and those allies have allies, and soon Europe is engulfed in war with countries from around the world participating in what was called at the time the Great War, or the war to end all wars. But in reality it was only an appetizer to the all-out destruction and human brutality of World War II. That's the popular story, but in reality the war didn't start just because of the alienation. In fact, after the alienation, the Austro-Hungarian government sent a list of demands to Serbia. Serbia actually accepted all but one of those demands. When the news was sent to the German Kaiser, he is said to have scribbled in the margin a great moral victory for Austria. No doubt, but with it goes any moral justification for the war. The truth is, the European nations went to war because they wanted to, and had been wanting to for a while. In Germany's case, they wanted to fight Russia. This was because of a railway system Russia was building. We can see in some German military communique from quite a while before the whole Bosnia-Herzegovina issue. Some of the top brass were worried about the Russian railway system that would be complete by 1920 and were expressing fear that once it did, they would be unable to match the sheer amount of manpower Russia could send to the front. If they had to have a war with Russia, it would have to be before that, and they must never recover from it. In France's case, they wanted to recover the provinces of Elsa and Lotharingen that Prussia had seized from them in the previous century. She hopefully carve out a separate state in their traditional allies in South Germany out of the German Empire. For Britain, it was about the navy and the economy. Germany had gotten into a naval arms race with Britain for a while, and Britain's solution to that was to build 2 warships for every one that Germany commissioned. However, as the new German nation started getting more and more industrialized and economically powerful, they were able to build a lot more ships, and Britain worried that continuing that system would put too heavy a strain on their economy. This, along with Germany's new colonial ambitions, made them keen to cut Germany down to size. So even if the Archduke's alienation hadn't gone the way it had, or had not even happened at all, there still would have been a war. The Roman Emperor Caligula once declared war against Neptune, god of the ocean. He led his soldiers to a beach and instructed them to stab the water. Would have won too, had he recruited the Sand Guardian. The Great Emu Wars of Australia. Not to mention, the birds won. Due to a military standoff that took years, 15 ships became stranded in an inland sea, and over 8 years formed a multinational ship-based society that even included its own currency. Link. That sounds dope. Harold Holt, the PM of Australia, went for a swim in the ocean in 1967 and was never seen again. We named a pool after him. The Tamim Shud case. Shortly after WW2, a well-groomed athletic man was found dead on an Australian beach. There's no apparent cause of death. It is impossible to identify the man. Some mysterious clues are found. Among them, a book with a cryptic message written into it. Later, they bury his corpse compassionately. Even later, it turns out that he might have been searching for a child he possibly fathered some years ago, and that the mother possibly had been a spy who had fallen in love with a spy from abroad. The unidentified man, who might have fathered said child with her back then, as he realized that the mother wouldn't be meeting him anymore, he would have poisoned himself on the beach. And since he was a spy, he used a poison that doesn't leave a trace. They also suspected he was a ballerina due to his build. He had on him a piece of gum and a snippet of a page from a book that they found decades later with the mysterious writing on it. There's a whole ton of bizarre details, some of which don't quite add up. It's my favorite unsolved mystery, quite honestly. A couple tried to commit insurance fraud and blew up an entire neighborhood in Indianapolis several years ago, killing 2, injuring several, and destroying over 30 houses. Wikipedia. There's a Casa File episode on this. It's bizarre how people can be so smart and dumb at the same time. In 1980, Lake Pigner in Louisiana drained like a bathtub with the plug removed. Oil drillers on a rig in the lake had hit a mine shaft below. The rig, barges, a tugboat and part of a nearby island got sucked into the largest man-made whirlpool ever. It was a salt mine, and nobody died. The fact that Ohio and Michigan had a civil war. Knowing people from both states, I'm not entirely sure that ever ended. The guy from 4chan that said he was going to kill Bin Laden with a sword got found in the desert in the Middle East with his sword. Edit. Got the link from a reply to my comment. He was on dialysis and still tried to hunt this guy down. He needs a pardon for this. That the government would conduct clandestine experiments on its citizens. The first that comes to mind is the syphilis experiments at Tuskegee. I didn't look at countries outside the US. Wait. There's more. Wikipedia. Wait till you find out that the mail bomber Ted Kaczynski was one student who was experimented on in the MK Ultra program. The Emu War of 1932. Australia's emu population was getting out of hand. Australia decided to take military action. Australia lost. Twice. Wikipedia. 9 Italian geologists being charged with manslaughter for not predicting an earthquake. Edit. Alright, good news, I was wrong. They were charged because they didn't properly warn people, not because they didn't predict it. In 1993, a man taught geese to follow his ultralight aircraft glider. They didn't know how to migrate, so he flew all the way to an area where geese generally migrate to with his geese following. This is a movie called Fly Away Home. The entire life of Julie d'Aubigny, bisexual sword master, heartthrob turned opera singer who lived her life entirely for the lulz. Beat the jizz out of dudes and sword duels, and doing it topless whenever anyone doubted she was a lady. Got in trouble for making out with ladies at royal balls. Once became a nun to duck a nun, and then set fire to the convent. Chiz is so wild, it's insane. There's not a blockbuster movie about her. I never heard of her until I read your post. Just spent 2 hours reading everything I could find online. Thank you. The Christmas Truce of 1914 in WW1. The Bone Wars. Two rival paleontologists, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, were in a race for academic clout, so they both took off to places like the fossil beds of Montana and Utah to try and dig up as many dinosaurs as possible before the other guy. But they didn't stop there and hired spies and saboteurs to impede the other's work, as well as trying to power off sloppy or fake skeletons sometimes. The overwhelming majority of iconic dinosaur genre that we know were either first discovered or simply got a lot of new samples to work with and were made iconic by the amount of publicity they received. This includes Triceratops, Stegosaurus, some remains of Tyrannosaurus, Apatosaurus, and many more. This is also where the Brontosaurus confusion comes from. One of the scientists, I forget who, had already discovered Apatosaurus. The other then discovered a new skeleton of the same dinosaur, but intentionally put a skull from a different species, Camarasaurus, onto that skeleton, and tried to pair it off as a new species entirely, Brontosaurus. The fake was unveiled pretty quickly, but the name stuck. More recently, however, we have a lot more tools to distinguish smaller features from bones, and it was found that the skeleton that was originally paired off as Brontosaurus is actually barely different enough to receive its own genus, and the name Brontosaurus was revived. I've always thought that this could make a fantastic show, especially if it includes dramatized flashbacks to how the dinosaurs and the skeletons died. Edit. The Wikipedia page's intro describes it very nicely as well. The Bone Wars, also known as the Great Dinosaur Rush, was a period of intense and ruthlessly competitive fossil hunting and discovery during the Gilded Age of American history, marked by a heated rivalry between Edward Drinker Cope of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia and Othniel Charles Marsh of the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale. Each of the two paleontologists used underhanded methods to try to outdo the other in the field, resorting to bribery, theft, and the destruction of bones. Each scientist also sought to ruin his rival's reputation and cut off his funding, using attacks in scientific publications. Wikipedia Reddit. It's worth noting that the Bone Wars have had a massive positive legacy on paleontology as a field, but left both scientists financially and socially ruined. An excellent bittersweet ending. Bulgarian swineherd. King Ivalo the swineherd became a king and won a battle against the trained army of the current king of that time. Most of the random fictional sounding events in the world can be found on YouTube with Salmonella Academy. The videos are hilarious and just shows how ridiculous some people were, plus the videos are relatively short and you stay interested till the end. Russia's fake Dmitry Ivan the Terrible's son alienated at the age of 8. 9 years later a guy claims to be the Dmitry having had survived the alienation attempt. He gains the throne and rules for 11 months. Then dragged from the palace and publicly executed. Mark the end of false Dmitry 1. Then it gets interesting. The next year a second imposter declared himself Dmitry, but doesn't dispute Dmitry 1's legitimacy, instead claiming to be the same guy having miraculously survived his apparent execution a year before, and somehow wins political support of Dmitry 1's widow, and with her support gains the allegiance of the Cossacks, rallies an army of over 10,000 strong and tries to take back the throne. Though is mostly failed, he conquers most of southeastern Russia and rule until his untimely death 3 years later, after being beheaded by a Tatar prince in a drunken altercation. Mark end of false Dmitry 2. 3 months later, when impostor 3 pops up, apparently magically appearing from behind a waterfall in Ivangorod, and declared himself Tsar. He follows Dmitry 2's lead and doesn't dispute the other 2 imposters, instead claiming some sort of spiritual reincarnation or magical resurrection to establish himself as the same guy. He managed to win support of the same Cossacks who supported Dmitry 2's claim. He was forced to flee his stronghold only a year later, where he was speared on the way to Moscow and secretly executed, though he never actually ruled. Historians stuck with the theme, naming him false Dmitry 3. History gets fuzzy here, with some source citing a false Dmitry 4, while others say it is counting Dmitry 3 twice. Fake Dmitry 1 was a known fake. The powers that be used him until he was trouble and then executed him. They quartered him, cremating what was left, stuffed the ashes in a can, and shoot him in a cannon back to Poland, where he was from. During the Cold War, Americans wanted to intimidate the Russians, so they dropped extra large condoms labeled small on the Russian army, so the Russians would think all Americans had huge ericks and they would feel inadequate. Isn't there somewhere in northern European waters where there's a submerged sign stating this way, if you're gay or some chiz, intended to deter Russian submarines? Dr. Robert Liston performed an operation that ended up with a 300% mortality rate. He was amputating a leg of a patient. During this he sliced off the fingers of a patient. They both died of infection. He also slashed the coattails of a spectator, who was so terrified that the knife pierced his vital organs that he died from fright. Leo Major, a French-Canadian soldier who, among many other feats including capturing a German communications truck, losing an eye to a phosphorus grenade in the process, and capturing 100 German soldiers while on a recon mission during the Battle of Scheldt. He single-handedly liberated the town of Zwolle, thereby saving it and its population from being shelled in an hour in the morning. During this liberation he captured 90 more Germans, burned down the Gestapo HQ, and generally rampaged around shooting and throwing grenades, so that the Germans thought they were being attacked in earnest. Dude was basically a Call of Duty protagonist. It should be noted that he was offered a medal for his achievements, but refused it on the grounds that he believed his commanding officers to be incompetent and not fit to bestow such honors. all of the arsonation attempts on Castro. Only 7 are confirmed, but there are 638 supposed ones. Basically they read like a comedy sketch. The CIA once places a cool seashell rugged with explosives in a place where they thought Castro would see it, go to a cool shell, and pick it up. Despite this genius, he died of natural causes. Edit. Here is a short video on the 7 confirmed attempts. Edit 2. And here is a video about Castro's insane love of dairy. In fact, the CIA tried to poison his chocolate milkshake as one of the attempts. The mafioso who was supposed to poison the drink broke the pill when he was taking it out of the freezer. In July 1518, residents of the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, were struck by a sudden and seemingly uncontrollable urge to dance. The hysteria kicked off when a woman known as Frau Trophia stepped into the street and began to silently twist, twirl and shake. She kept up her solo dance-a-thon for nearly a week, and before long, some 3 dozen other Strasbourgians had joined in. By August, the dancing epidemic had claimed as many as 400 victims. The strange episode didn't end until September, when the dancers were whisked away to a mountaintop shrine to pray for absolution. The funny thing is that there is not really an explanation for what happened. Explanations range from medical issues, known as hot blood, to curses being placed on people. They died of disco fever. Brazil going to waste on war with boats, panicking when seeing bubbles, and ended up killing a rare species of dwarf whale that they thought were German submarines attacking. Source: here. Our battle whales haven't returned yet. The Great Locust Swarm of 1875. At one point the swarm was measured to be 100,000 square miles, and the locust would eat everything in their path, even each other. The swarm was so thick that whenever it passed over an area it would block out the sun. Farm progress. The 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. The beginning felt like a movie. Terrible movie. 0 stars. Probably that time the US government hooked listening equipment to a cat so it could spy on Russians, only to realize that cats don't follow commands, and then it got hit by a car. My grandpa had his balls chopped off, but he managed to sew it together. Buddy, you can't just leave that there and wander off about your day. Tell us more about the man with the cleaved ball sack. The Canadian government starved indigenous people to death just to scientifically determine how long it took people to starve to death. Google Newfoundland flour mix. I googled that and only found bread recipes. What happened? Edit. Found one article too here. The Carrington event. In 1859 the earth was hit by a geomagnetic storm from the sun. It caused auroras as far south as Rome. Telegraph wires caught fire, and in general it was chaos. If this happened today it would likely cause massive blackouts for weeks or even months, and cause trillions in damage. Please don't even make that suggestion. At least, not this year. A psychopath from a reality show ending up in the Oval Office. The USSR sent turtles to the moon and they came back making them the first organisms to return from a flyby of the moon. Mercer one-upped them by sending Neil Armstrong though. Oh my. You watched until the end? That's fucking awesome dude. Thanks for watching.